gosh.
We made it. It's episode 3, live today on June 8th. Happy summertime. Welcome back.
Yeah, welcome back, everyone. This is Johnny.
This is Nicolette. You're listening to the Wise Action Radio Show from Rainier Avenue Radio. Cool. Wow. Episode 3, live today.
And that intro, can't get enough of it.
So
That's from
good.
Biko.
Shout out Biko. So good. I love it. It's very calming. I needed that after being semi-late today. You guys ever forget about time? I do. Anyway, welcome back. We're talking about decolonization again. So if you tuned into last week's episode or the week before last episode, you'll have a little bit of an idea of what we're talking about. If not, we're talking about decolonization and what that means and the way that that actually looks rather than decolonization as a metaphor, if you're catching my drift. What are you thinking about, Johnny?
Well, last week it was very philosophical, I think, and we shared a pretty broad framework of how we're thinking about decolonization. And I mean, if we did decolonization and did like a deep dive, it'd probably be like 100 episodes. But
could be this entire show.
Yeah. But anyways, we're gonna do episode 2 of decolonization. So I'm excited. What do you have for us?
I've got a lot. It's hard, at least for me, to not sort of get into this like heady conversation about decolonization, and this kind of is a through line from last week's episode of for me and my positionality. I'm looking at decolonization through more of a learning lens, right? So I'm reading about it. I'm having these conversations with you and other people and getting my perspectives broadened through sort of this educational component rather than a direct and historical connection to it in terms of like experiencing what colonization is and therefore having a better understanding of what decolonization might look like. So that kind of segues nicely into what I wanted to bring up for you. Again, I said last week's episode was a little heady. You talked about it being a little bit more philosophical. I wanted to talk a little bit about the tangible aspects of decolonization, about what that actually looks like in practice and in praxis. So I guess opening for a kind of a broad, open-ended question for you, Johnny, what does decolonization look like to you? It can be many things. It can be one thing. It can be, whatever you want it to be. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
Wow, that's a pretty open, broad, deep question. And I think I draw a blank like right away. But what comes to mind is when I first stepped on the Northwest Indian College campus up on the Lummi Indian Reservation, it was difficult being a first generation student and moving away from my tight knit village and all of the roles and responsibilities of just like living off of the land and ceremonies that happen at our longhouse and removing myself and detaching from those things was difficult. But how do I continue to have that relationship, that personal relationship with culture and these spaces of healing and prayer and ceremony and even connection with other Native people. So one of the things I had learned that I needed really quick was we in my home village, we sweated probably like 4 or 5 times on average per week. So that was a sweat lodge ceremony, just the evenings or in the mornings, like after work or before work. We would do sweat lodge ceremonies. So that was one thing I was missing. And, taking on coursework and, upwards of some crazy things like 25 credits a quarter. I did that once. I don't suggest it to anybody, but it was very ambitious. And I actually got all A's. But I couldn't have done it without advocating to have a sweat lodge on the campus made available for the students. And of course, we had to go, just go jump through all the hoops and do the hoop dances and all of that stuff. And essentially, we got one and was able to, uh, and it's right in the middle of the campus. So it was, you know, for natives that do have like the sweat lodge and the culture and stuff, and even for the locals, were able to participate. And it was a reclamation of like space and culture and ceremony. Even a small piece of land that we were given to build a lodge, and it happened to be right in the middle of campus. So I think that's one thing that comes to mind when I think of decolonization in my own personal life. I think there's others, like when I moved away to like getting a a beach house on the Lummi Indian Reservation on the Lummi shores there. I was able to practice singing in the morning. So just ceremonial prayers and songs to be able, to ground myself that way and stay connected. And that was huge. But it shifts from time to time. Now I'm in like downtown Seattle, and my with respect to like my neighbors and all of that stuff, it's much more difficult. I don't find myself practicing as much of that prayer and song in the morning, because out on a beach house and like a remote, like rural area, it's easy just to belt out songs and stuff. But so it's like a ebb and a flow, a sine and a cosine, and mountains and valleys of. I guess that's how colonization kind of comes in waves for me, and decolonization comes in waves for me.
Wow, thank you for sharing. One of the things that I'm hearing from that story and from what I'm remembering from our last episode was this idea of a holistic approach to things, especially when it comes to both colonization and decolonization. And I'm thinking about your experience with bringing sweat lodges into your time at Northwest Indian College, and how that sort of holistic experience was really integral for you and really important for you. And I'm reflecting on my experience in my undergraduate experience being in like a hard science background at a liberal arts school in Florida that was very, very cut and dry. It was very much, here are the facts and here is this isolated thing. And that's the only thing that needs to be considered. It was very black and white. There was sort of no gray area. It was very binary. And I sort of held those perspectives for a long time because of it, in the sense of like, oh, you need to have an unbiased opinion. You need to go in with your control variables. You need to do everything like by the book. And it's very compartmentalized. It's got, I keep wanting to say like institutionalized, and I'm not sure if that's the right word, but that's what's coming to me. So that's what I'm going to use. And it wasn't until I sort of broke out of that mindset of things are a certain type of way and they have to be that way, and they only have to be that way because that's what's true and that's what's proven, and that's what science tells us is the right way, or that's what someone else tells us is the right way, and incorporating other things like human dimensions or cultural dimensions or spiritual dimensions into fields of study, into ways of knowing and viewing the world is just not it's not professional. It's not what should be done. And it took me a long time to sort of break out of that and realize, wow, that's pretty problematic, because that's not how things are really. Things in the real world are very interconnected. And so that holistic approach of in school and academia and in life, and then also you've got these other really important things such as spirituality, such as culture, such as ceremony, and bringing those things together and having that be an acceptable way of knowing, I think, is really, really beautiful and also really important in subverting a colonial mindset where things have to be a certain way and they have to be by a book. And who wrote that book is the main question that you have to get to, is like, who's setting those rules up? Who's setting people up for failure and for success? And where does that come from? Why is it that we view things such as culture and ceremony and spirituality as outside of, what's fact or what's respectable fact or something, right? So I find that really interesting, and just reiterating the importance of like a holistic component when looking at colonization and decolonization. And I guess when I'm thinking about like colonization in particular, I'm not necessarily thinking about the like pilgrims or British colonizers coming hundreds of years ago. I'm thinking like right now, our institutions, what they hold important and what they hold as factual is very particular in like perpetuating a way of thinking that doesn't really allow space for the things that you're talking about, such as ceremony and culture. So I feel like I'm rambling a little bit. And I guess, yeah. What are your thoughts on this conversation so far?
Oh, I appreciate your thoughts, and I mean, they're very poignant and interesting to me, and I think really emphasizing how things are interconnected is really important for all people to understand. It's it's an indigenous perspective. It's a very unique to my culture. Perspective, and the way that holistic approach looks is unique to all indigenous cultures, and how we see ourselves in the world, and for me, like some of our earliest learnings, or that come from our law, that we believe, which we have laws, and they're not written down, so it's not a wrote down thing. They're oral laws. So we have and there's a whole set of laws, and I think it's important. Those things are important to learn and understand as an individual, because in those laws and in those stories of how those laws came to be, those relationships, those interconnections are there with all people, places, and things, and with each other as relatives, and also some people will refer to it as the medicine wheel, and how we look at spirituality, mentality, physical, those different parts of our lives. And even when we think about holistically what it looks like now, there's even more parts. We even have the financial part, the education part, and we can just keep listing those different parts of us that make us up holistically. And I think it's important to consider and actually know those things, to have a holistic perspective on ourselves, because if we don't, and we don't assess where we're at with each of those, because ideally we're going to say that we want to be this type of person with all of these values, and these are the things that are important in my life. How am I doing in these areas of my life, right? Dang, I took this assessment. I'm not where I want to be, because I want to be, ideally I want to be here, but having a thorough assessment and evaluation is really important to be able to find ourselves where we want to be.
Yeah. Wow. I have a thought, and I'm just going to give a little reminder. You're listening to the Wise Action Radio Show on Rainier Avenue Radio. My name is Nicolette. I'm here with my co-host Johnny from the Illahee Fund. Today we're talking about decolonization. And yeah, one of the things that I'm thinking of that I always come back to is I remember being at a marine protected area in college for a study abroad somewhere in like Italy. And I remember talking to the person who was like running that area or was helping sort of lead the project. And I remember him like telling me that in their studies, in their like ecosystem studies, that they include the local fishermen in those studies and in the conversations that they're having about how to protect that area. And it was the first time really that I had heard a like scientific project incorporate like the people who are from the area in a way of these people have been here for so long, so they're a part of this ecosystem. And it was the first sort of like moment where I was like, oh my God, I don't know anything of, I've had this perspective that, you know, things are isolated, things are compartmentalized, and like humans don't have a role or humans are inherently bad. And like it was the first time I really broke out of that and thinking like, wow, that's just not true. It's just that's not accurate at all. And then as I like began to learn more about Indigenous perspectives, and I think I mentioned Robin Wall Kimmerer before, but that braiding sweetgrass was another big just really laid the groundwork for a lot of thinking for me in terms of the importance of that connection, that relationship. And again, it's a point of I don't know if privilege is the right word that I got to learn about it, because I'm not sure how great my perspective beforehand was of that's just so narrow-minded. And breaking out of that was just like everything else opened up. It gave me a completely different look on things. But yeah, that was again something that I learned. That was something that I was presented with way later in life. And I think that yeah, it's disappointing to know that the relationship aspect and the interconnectedness is not something that is a common lens in which to view the world in Western society. Because if you look at like your nuclear family structure, connectedness is not a part of that. It's again, it's very compartmentalized, and you don't build relationships and you don't build community and you don't have a means of organizing with the people that you're around and like having that sort of solidarity and camaraderie with people and with place. And it's it's very dark and gloomy when you really think about it, when you see the other side of it and you realize like what the standard is. It's, at least from my perspective, I think this is really sad, and why is it keeping us like this? And that comes back to what I was saying earlier of like that's that modern form of colonialism of like perpetuating those like ways of living that maintain our current power structures, right? So yeah, just lots to think about in this conversation. And I know we said we were going to try to get a little bit less heady and less philosophical, but it feels like it's still kind of going in that direction, which I'm not sure how to, like I said, that's hard for me to not sort of go there. So I'm not sure how to mediate that, I guess.
Well, I think it's difficult. I think we have to exhaust the whole philosophical perspective of decolonization first as a premise.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's most important, because that's going to get into like probably the logical reasoning, you know,
Mm-hmm.
that everything else is going to be standing upon. And you know, I think taking a look also at that we're doing it in the English language too,
Mm-hmm.
and it's coming from Western science, so to speak. And you know, shout out to like a number of the indigenous researchers out there around the globe who have taken on um, setting the foundational elements of indigenous research methodology,
Mm-hmm.
and taking on the topics of decolonization or re-indigenizing, you know. Um, but there's far and few in between, you know. And
Mm-hmm.
when I was going to Northwest Indian College and we were taking on, so my undergraduate degree was a bachelor's in science in what was called native environmental science. So that native part I looked at it as a decolonization curriculum.
Mm,
And the curriculum for that native part was called a cultural sovereignty curriculum.
mhm,
Um, and in that we was a research project every quarter. So we're required to take a class out of that curriculum every quarter. And it was like reclaiming identity, reclaiming language, reclaiming icons from our peoples and tribes. Uh, you name it, it was reclaiming.
mhm.
And so I took on the research methodology part very seriously. And I was just like, well, Western scientific research methodology isn't quite fitting for me because
Mhm.
there's a number of instances where what I want to do and how I want to do it, like culturally appropriately within my community, it doesn't fit in Western science methodology of
Right.
research. So I was trying to find indigenous research methodology, and unfortunately, from 2014, early on in my undergraduate as a freshman, um, I couldn't find anything. I think there were 2 books
Mm,
on. There was like Researcher's Ceremony, and there's another one. But basically, what was happening was we were still deciding what indigenous research methodology was composed of.
mhm.
So, anyways,
Yeah. Totally. I'm thinking a lot about what you were saying about how that sort of like Western science perspective and like um research methodology like didn't fit into what you were looking for. And I'm also thinking about how like um how indigenous research in like science and knowledge isn't validated by that Western science in that and in on a broader scale like policy, so like indigenous forms of governing isn't necessarily validated in Western policy structures, right? And the way that that sort of again is like intentional in oops sorry in maintaining like, well, why isn't it validated? And if it's not validated and but this other side is, why is that other side validated and this one isn't? Like what it's not that it's just different and it's just one is necessarily better than the other. It's a very intentional way of like maintaining a power structure and a hierarchy, right? So I'm thinking a lot about that and
yeah, I think you're referring to a systemic issue that
right.
continues to perpetuate oppression.
Right, exactly, exactly. And another thing that I kind of wanted to touch on, and I'm pulling again from Tuck and Yang's Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, which I talked about in our last episode as well. But just sort of the I guess the is and this is not necessarily a question that needs to be answered right now, but is validating those indigenous forms of knowledge within a Western system, is that decolonization? Because it's still within that structure, right? It's still functioning within this colonial power structure. It's still functioning. It's is being validated or recognized by the colonial power structure. Is that actually decolonization?
Hmm.
Or is it perpetuating the power structure, but just in a different font, right? And I was thinking on my train ride over here about how, and we had kind of talked about this before too, of like checking a box of saying like, oh, well, we've got indigenous representation, or we're incorporating traditional ecological knowledge into this report or something. Is that necessarily decolonization, or is it decolonization washing in the sense of like greenwashing, right? So I was thinking about that. And again, that's not maybe something that can be fully answered in the last 5 minutes of this show, but just something that was on my mind on the way over here today and during this conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think what you bring up for me by asking that question is I was just at a Board of Regents meeting this morning at University of Washington.
Mm,
So the Board of Regents has a quarterly meeting, and it was actually the first time uh, Native group got to present in front of the Board of Regents. So now there's a tribal relations director, director of the intellectual house. There was an undergraduate student. There was a graduate student, me, the Human-Centered Design and Engineering program at UW, and we got to present. And there's actually one Board of Regent, Leonard Forsman, who's Suquamish tribal member, and I was just thinking as I was listening to the earlier speakers and earlier parts of the agenda of their meeting, I was getting the hunch that this may be the first time, and I was just like, and so I asked the tribal relations director, I was just like, "Is this the first time?" She was like, "Yeah, this is the first time," and I was like, "Oh wow!" So I think we're maybe like 10 years behind or something. Like
at least,
yeah, it's kind of eye-opening. It's the first time, but I got to have like 5 minutes to share my experience, and what I shared was one of the barriers I hit in the financial aid system, and I shared how the University of Washington can strengthen their relationship with the tribal community, especially tribal college students there at the University of Washington, by taking a look at this systemic issue. And it would only mean increasing the cost of attendance. And when we think of increasing the cost of attendance, it's like, oh, do we really want to do that? No, but it's counterintuitive because there's two parts of the cost of attendance. One, the direct costs, and that's tuition and fees. And then there's indirect costs. That's for living expenses.
Right.
So if we increase the cost for living expenses, and say and I was only talking about tribal students because it's important that students, that young people, anybody, that people have a strong connection with their culture and heritage. That's going to build resilience and any of the things that they take on in life, right? So if we have resources to be able to stay connected with our communities, that means travel back for ceremonies and meetings and visiting with relatives, that we're going to do better in whatever it is that we do. And if we're if we have access to those resources, that means we can really begin to thrive in an academic setting.
Right.
Would I say that's decolonization? I would say so.
Right. Yeah. I'm thinking a lot about one of the important elements of decolonization being sort of sacrificing privilege and land in order to sort of turn that sort of white supremacist status quo on its head. And that's it sounds like that's sort of what you're getting at, is if this university has these resources and is able to give those resources back to tribal students in order to help them thrive in a Western academic setting, is that setting that groundwork for decolonization in a way, right? And yeah, and that opens a whole nother can of worms when talking about giving back, giving resources, specifically giving resources in a sense of cutting the systemic change or perpetuating systemic change. But anyway, that's about our time. Thank you all for listening. Hopefully we'll talk about this more later. My name is Nicolette.
I'm Johnny, and yeah, thank you all for listening. Hope you have a great rest of your day and the week.